Picture this. You come home from a weekend trip to find 50 strangers in formal wear partying in your family barn. The HOA president who has been harassing you for months is directing cleanup crews like she owns the place. She looks you dead in the eye and says you were not using the space anyway. My great-grandfather built that barn with his own hands in 1923. 3 generations of my family worked that land. But Karen Mitchell thought she could just take it because I was not there to stop her. I stood there watching her smug face as she threatened to call the police on me, on my own property. That was the moment I realized something had to be done. Karen wanted to play games with my livelihood and my family legacy. Little did she know, I had 2 very large friends who were about to crash her next party. 2,000-pound friends with horns and attitude. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a third-generation cattle rancher. My family has owned this 40-acre spread outside of Millbrook for over a century. My great-grandfather cleared this land by hand back in 1923. My grandfather expanded the operation in the 50s. My father passed it down to me 15 years ago with the understanding that I would keep the Morrison legacy alive. Every morning at 5:30, I walk the fence line checking on my prize Holstein bulls. Thunder and Goliath are my pride and joy. Each one weighs over 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and determination. They are gentle giants most of the time, but they command respect. The old red barn where they shelter has weathered countless storms and seasons. Its wooden beams still bear the marks from my great-grandfather's hand tools. For most of my life, we were surrounded by farmland and open fields. But 5 years ago, everything started changing. Developers bought up the surrounding properties and built Meadowbrook Hills, a massive subdivision with nearly 200 homes. Suddenly, my working ranch was an island in a sea of manicured lawns and identical houses. At first, the new neighbors seemed friendly enough. They waved when they drove past. Some even stopped to admire Thunder and Goliath from the fence line. I thought we could coexist peacefully. I was wrong. The complaints started small. Someone did not like the smell of manure when the wind blew east. Another person found the rooster crowing at dawn to be disruptive. I tried to be understanding. I knew city folks were not used to farm life. I even moved the chicken coop further from the property line to reduce noise. But the complaints kept coming, and they all seemed to flow through one person, Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. Karen was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an attitude that could freeze water. She drove a white BMW and wore designer clothes to grocery store trips. Her house was the largest in the subdivision, positioned on a hill that overlooked my property. She had a clear view of everything I did from her kitchen window. The first time I met Karen face to face, she showed up at my front door with a clipboard and a fake smile. "Hello there," she said in a voice that dripped with condescension. "I am Karen Mitchell from the HOA. We need to discuss some concerns about your property." I invited her in for coffee, thinking we could work things out like neighbors. She declined and stayed on the porch, making notes on her clipboard as she talked. "The residents are concerned about property values," she continued. "Your barn is quite visible from several homes, and the smell, well, it is not exactly what people expect in a premium neighborhood." I explained that my family had been here long before the subdivision was even planned. I showed her the grandfather clause in the county records that protected my farming rights. I thought that would be the end of it. "Well," Karen said, snapping her clipboard shut, "we will see about that." That was 6 months ago. Since then, the HOA has been having monthly meetings to discuss property standards and community improvement. I was not invited to these meetings, but word gets around in a small town. They were discussing my ranch at every single one. The tension was building like storm clouds on the horizon. I could feel it in every interaction with my new neighbors. Some still waved, but others turned away when they saw me coming. Karen had been busy spreading her influence throughout the community. I had no idea how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted, but I was about to find out. The harassment started 3 months after my first meeting with Karen. It began with certified letters delivered to my mailbox every few weeks, official-looking envelopes with the HOA letterhead and legal language that made my head spin. The first letter complained about unsightly agricultural equipment being visible from residential properties. They were referring to my tractor and hay baler, tools I needed to maintain my property. The letter demanded I build a privacy fence to hide them from view. The second letter cited excessive noise ordinances because my rooster crowed at dawn. They wanted me to get rid of my chickens entirely. When I pointed out that roosters naturally crow at sunrise and that was normal farm behavior, they suggested I was being unreasonable. Each letter came with threats of legal action and fines. I started keeping a file folder just to track all the complaints. My kitchen table became covered with documents and legal papers. The stress was affecting my sleep and my work. But Karen was just getting started. On a Tuesday morning in late September, I was feeding Thunder and Goliath when I saw Karen marching across my property with 5 other neighbors trailing behind her. She was carrying a clipboard and had her phone out, taking pictures of everything. "Excuse me," I called out as they approached the barn. "This is private property." Karen stopped and turned to face me with that fake smile plastered on her face. "We are conducting a neighborhood inspection," she announced. "The residents have complained about noise pollution from your roosters disturbing their sleep." "My roosters crow at dawn," I replied. "That is what roosters do. It has been that way for 15 years. "Well, it is unacceptable now," Karen shot back. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm." The confrontation lasted 20 minutes. Karen took pictures of my chicken coop, my barn, and even my house. She made notes about everything while her followers nodded in agreement. When I asked for legal authority to be on my property, she claimed they were conducting a community welfare inspection. 2 weeks later, a health department inspector showed up at my door. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint about unsanitary conditions and potential health hazards from my livestock operation. The inspector spent 3 hours going through my barn, checking my records, and examining my animals. "Everything looks fine here," he told me as he packed up his equipment. "Your operation is clean and well-maintained. Whoever called this in was wasting everyone's time." But the damage was done. My reputation in the community took a hit. Neighbors started looking at me differently. Some people I had known for years began avoiding me at the grocery store. A month later, a county zoning inspector appeared. Another anonymous complaint, this time claiming I was running an illegal commercial livestock operation without proper permits. I had to dig out decades of paperwork to prove my farming rights and show that everything was properly documented. The inspector was more aggressive than the health department official. He measured buildings, checked fence lines, and questioned every aspect of my operation. After 2 days of investigation, he confirmed that all my permits were in order and my grandfather clause protected my farming rights. "Someone is really trying to cause problems for you," he said quietly as he left. "You might want to get a lawyer." That night, I called my attorney and explained the situation. The legal fees were going to be expensive, but I needed protection from the constant harassment. We filed paperwork to document the pattern of false complaints and began building a case for harassment. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign. She appeared at city council meetings demanding that my property be rezoned as residential only. She started a petition among the HOA members to pressure local officials. She even contacted the local newspaper with complaints about agricultural incompatibility in residential areas. The final straw came on a cold November evening. I was sitting on my porch after a long day of work when Corinne pulled into my driveway. She got out of her BMW and walked up to my steps with purpose in her stride. "I am going to make this simple for you," she said without any pretense of politeness. "Sell your property and move somewhere more appropriate for your lifestyle, or we will make your life so miserable you will wish you had." I stood up slowly, looking down at this woman who thought she could intimidate me off my family land. "Is that a threat?" I asked. Karen smiled coldly. "It is a promise. We have resources you cannot imagine, legal connections, political influence, and the entire community behind us. You cannot win this fight." She turned and walked back to her car, leaving me standing on the porch where 3 generations of my family had watched the sun set over our land. That night, I realized the gloves were off. Corinne Mitchell had declared war on my family legacy. She had no idea what she was up against. The weekend of November 15th changed everything. I had planned a trip to a cattle auction 3 hours away in Springfield. Thunder and Goliath were getting older, and I wanted to look at some younger breeding stock for the future. I loaded them into my trailer early Saturday morning and headed out, expecting to return Sunday evening. The auction was successful. I found 2 promising young bulls and spent the day networking with other ranchers. It felt good to be around people who understood farming and respected the work involved. For the first time in months, I was able to relax and forget about my problems with the HOA. I was driving home Sunday evening around 7 when I saw the lights. As I turned onto my road, I could see unusual brightness coming from the direction of my property. At first, I thought maybe there was an emergency, but as I got closer, I realized the lights were coming from my barn. My heart started racing as I pulled into my driveway. The scene in front of me was like something from a nightmare. My 40-acre property was filled with cars. Dozens of vehicles were parked across my pastures, their tires cutting deep ruts into the grass that had taken years to establish. I could hear music and laughter coming from inside my barn. Professional lighting equipment was set up around the building, casting bright beams across my property. There were tables and chairs arranged in my yard, and I could see people in formal wear moving around inside the barn. I sat in my truck for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My family barn, the building my great-grandfather had constructed with his own hands, had been transformed into some kind of party venue. The violation felt like a physical blow to my chest. I got out of my truck and walked toward the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel. As I got closer, I could see the full extent of the setup. Professional sound equipment, catering tables, decorative lighting, and even a small stage had been installed inside the barn. The smell of expensive food and wine mixed with the familiar scent of hay and old wood. The worst part was seeing Corinne Mitchell in the center of it all. She was wearing an elegant black dress and directing a cleanup crew like she owned the place. She was pointing at different areas of the barn and giving instructions about where to place equipment and furniture. When she saw me approaching, she did not look surprised or embarrassed. Instead, she walked over with that same condescending smile I had grown to hate. "Oh, Jake," she said casually, as if she was greeting me at a neighborhood barbecue. "You are back early. We were not expecting you until tomorrow." I stood there speechless, trying to find words for the outrage I was feeling. My family barn had been turned into a party venue without my knowledge or permission. The sacred space where my father had taught me to work with cattle, and where my grandfather had stored equipment for decades, was being used as a playground for entitled suburbanites. "What the hell is this?" I finally managed to ask. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Community Improvement Project. We decided to put this space to better use since you were not doing anything with it anyway." "This is my property," I said, my voice rising. "This is my barn. You had no right." "Actually," Karen replied, pulling out her phone, "we have been monitoring your property usage for months. This barn sits empty most of the time. We thought it would be perfect for community events and neighborhood gatherings." I looked around at the party guests, many of whom I recognized as my neighbors. Some looked uncomfortable when they saw me, but others seemed to think this was perfectly normal. A few even raised their glasses in greeting as if I was supposed to be happy about the violation. "You need to get everyone out of here right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen laughed. "I do not think so. We have permits for this event. Everything is completely legal." "Permits for what? You do not have permission to use my property." "Community space utilization," Karen said, showing me an official-looking document on her phone. "We filed all the proper paperwork with the county. This is a legitimate community improvement initiative." I grabbed her phone to look at the document more closely. It was filled with legal language and official seals, but I could not understand most of it. The paperwork looked authentic, but I knew it could not be legal to use someone else's property without permission. "This is theft," I said, handing her phone back. Karen's demeanor shifted from fake friendliness to cold hostility. "Listen carefully, Jake. We have spent a lot of money on this event. We have catering, entertainment, and 50 guests who drove here from across the county. If you cause any trouble, I will call the police and have you arrested for disturbing the peace." "On my own property." "On community space during a permitted event," Karen corrected. "I suggest you go back to your house and let us finish our evening. We will be done by midnight." I stood there watching her walk away, feeling completely powerless. The legal system I had trusted to protect my property rights seemed to be working against me. The barn that represented 3 generations of my family's hard work had been stolen from me by bureaucratic manipulation. That night, I sat on my porch listening to the sounds of the party until well past midnight. The violation went deeper than just the use of my barn. It was an attack on everything my family had built and everything I believed about property rights and respect for others. Karen Mitchell had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had made this personal. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen staring at the legal documents my attorney had given me, trying to understand how Karen had managed to get permits to use my property. The more I read, the more confused and angry I became. At dawn, I walked out to survey the damage. My pastures were torn up from dozens of cars. There were food containers and decorations scattered across my property. The barn still smelled like expensive perfume and wine, masking the familiar scents of hay and leather that had been there for decades. I called my lawyer first thing Monday morning. "They cannot legally use your property without permission," he assured me. "Whatever permits they filed, they are invalid, but the legal process to stop them could take months." "Months?" I asked. "They are planning another event next weekend." "Civil remedies take time," he explained. "We can file injunctions and sue for damages, but the courts move slowly. And if they have official permits, even invalid ones, it complicates things. I hung up feeling more frustrated than ever. The legal system that was supposed to protect property owners was too slow to prevent ongoing violations. Karen could continue using my barn while lawyers argued about paperwork. That afternoon, I discovered the full extent of Karen's arrogance. She had posted pictures from the party on social media, bragging about the successful community event and the beautiful venue. She was already promoting the next gathering, calling it a neighborhood improvement celebration. The comments on her posts made my blood boil. Neighbors were praising her for bringing the community together and making better use of underutilized space. She was being celebrated for stealing my property. But the worst part was her response to someone who asked about the property owner's permission. "Sometimes you have to take initiative to improve the community," she wrote. "Not everyone understands progress." I sat in my truck outside the barn that evening, watching Thunder and Goliath graze in the adjacent pasture. These two massive bulls had been with me for 8 years. They were calm, intelligent animals who knew their territory and protected what belonged to them. Thunder was the larger of the two, weighing close to 2,500 pounds. His black and white markings made him look like a living statue when he stood still. Goliath was slightly smaller but more aggressive, especially when he felt his space was being invaded. Both bulls had been raised on this property. They knew every inch of the land and considered the barn their shelter. They were gentle with me but could be intimidating to strangers. I had seen them chase off coyotes and stray dogs without hesitation. As I watched them in the fatting light, an idea began forming in my mind. Karen thought she could take my property and use it for her parties. She thought she could violate my family legacy without consequences. She had made one critical miscalculation. She had never met Thunder and Goliath. I spent the next 3 days researching property rights and self-defense laws. I learned about the legal concept of protecting your property from trespassers. I studied cases where property owners had used reasonable force to remove unauthorized people from their land. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I had options Karen never considered. She was so focused on bureaucratic manipulation that she forgot about more direct approaches to property protection. On Thursday, I found out about her next party. Karen had sent invitations to the entire subdivision for a harvest celebration in my barn. She was charging $20 per person and advertising professional catering and entertainment. She was literally profiting from the theft of my property. That night, I made my decision. I was done playing by rules that only applied to me. I was done letting lawyers and bureaucrats decide the fate of my family land. I was done being the victim of Karen Mitchell's power games. I had 2,000-pound allies who had never been properly introduced to my HOA problem. Thunder and Goliath were about to meet their new neighbors in a way that would make this conflict very personal for everyone involved. Karen wanted to use my barn for parties. She wanted to bring the community together in my space. She wanted to make better use of my property. I was about to give her exactly what she asked for. The next community gathering was going to be more memorable than she ever imagined. The plan was simple. Let Karen set up her second party. Let her invite all her friends and neighbors. Let her charge admission and hire expensive catering. Let her feel completely confident that she had won. Then introduce her to the real owners of the property. The week before Karen's second party was the most focused I had been in months. Every detail mattered. Every preparation could mean the difference between justice and disaster. First, I needed to ensure everything I did was completely legal. I spent 2 days researching property protection laws and consulting with my attorney about theoretical scenarios. I never told him exactly what I was planning, but I made sure I understood my rights as a property owner dealing with trespassers. The key was documentation. I installed 6 security cameras around my property, positioned to capture every angle of the barn and surrounding areas. These cameras would record everything that happened, providing legal protection for my actions and evidence of the ongoing trespassing. Next, I worked on the barn itself. The main doors were old and heavy, operated by a manual sliding mechanism that required significant strength to move. I reinforced the door hardware and installed a remote-controlled latch system that would allow me to open the doors from a distance. The most important part of my preparation involved Thunder and Goliath. I moved them to the pasture directly adjacent to the barn, separated only by a simple gate that could be opened remotely. I made sure they were well fed and calm, following their normal routine so they would not be agitated or unpredictable. Both bulls knew the barn intimately. They had been sheltering there for years and considered it their territory. They were familiar with the space, the layout, and the normal sounds and smells. What they were not familiar with was loud music, formal parties, and dozens of strangers occupying their space. I spent hours with them that week, reinforcing our bond and making sure they trusted me completely. I needed them to be calm when I opened the gate, but I also needed them to be curious enough to investigate the unusual activity in their barn. Meanwhile, Karen was busy planning her elaborate celebration. She had hired a more expensive catering company this time, boasting on social media about the premium menu and professional entertainment she was providing. The invitation list had grown to over 60 people, and she was charging $30 per person instead of 20. I watched from my kitchen window as delivery trucks arrived Tuesday and Wednesday, bringing tables, chairs, and decorative items to transform my barn into an elegant venue. Karen supervised every detail, directing workers like a general commanding troops. She had also hired a DJ and installed a professional sound system. The music equipment alone was worth thousands of dollars. She was treating this like a major event, not a simple neighborhood gathering. On Friday, I made my final preparations. I tested the remote controls for the gate and barn doors multiple times to ensure they worked perfectly. I checked the camera systems and made sure the recording equipment had enough storage space for several hours of footage. I also made an anonymous phone call to the local news station. I told them there was going to be an interesting community event at my property on Saturday evening involving the ongoing HOA dispute. I suggested they might want to have a reporter in the area around 8 o'clock. The reporter I spoke with seemed intrigued by the story. HOA conflicts were popular news topics, and she mentioned they had received several calls about the situation over the past few months. She promised to have someone nearby to cover whatever happened. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, mild temperature, and a light breeze that would carry sounds across the property. Karen's setup crew arrived early to begin transforming the barn into a party venue. I spent the day maintaining my normal routine, feeding the animals and doing regular farm work. I wanted everything to appear completely normal. I checked on Thunder and Goliath multiple times, making sure they were calm and comfortable in their adjacent pasture. Around 4 o'clock, I positioned myself in my house where I could see the barn clearly while remaining out of sight. I had a clear view of the remote controls and could monitor the security camera feeds from my laptop. By 6 o'clock, guests were beginning to arrive. Expensive cars filled my driveway and spilled onto my pastures, just like the previous weekend. I watched well-dressed people walking into my barn, carrying wine glasses and chatting excitedly about the elegant venue. Karen arrived at 7:30 wearing a blue cocktail dress and high heels completely inappropriate for a farm setting. She greeted guests like a hostess welcoming people to her own home. The violation of seeing her act like she owned my property made my jaw clench. By 8 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Music filled the air, laughter echoed from inside the barn, and the catering staff was serving expensive food to 60 people who were celebrating on my stolen property. I watched Karen raise a glass of wine to toast the success of their community improvement project. She was completely confident in her victory, surrounded by neighbors who were praising her leadership and vision. She had no idea that Thunder and Goliath were grazing quietly just 30 feet away, separated from the party by a single gate that was about to open. It was time for the real hosts to make their entrance. 8:15 on Saturday evening. The party was at its peak. Elegant guests in expensive clothes were mingling inside my barn, enjoying catered food and professional entertainment. Karen was holding court near the makeshift bar, basking in the praise of her neighbors. The music was loud enough to cover the sound of the pasture gate opening. I watched through my security cameras as Thunder and Goliath lifted their massive heads, curious about the unusual noise and activity coming from their barn. For a moment, both bulls stood perfectly still, assessing the situation. They were intelligent animals who understood their territory and knew something was very wrong. The barn that had been their quiet shelter for years was filled with strange sounds, bright lights, and unfamiliar smells. Thunder moved first. At over 2,000 pounds, his steps were deliberate and powerful. He walked toward the barn with the confidence of an animal who owned the space. Goliath followed, slightly more cautious but equally determined to investigate. The first person to notice them was a woman in a red dress who had stepped outside for fresh air. She froze mid-conversation, her wine glass halfway to her mouth, staring at two massive bulls walking directly toward the barn entrance. She said to her companion, "Are those cows supposed to be here?" The man beside her turned to look and immediately understood they were not looking at gentle dairy cows. These were bulls. Massive, powerful bulls with horns and an attitude that suggested they were not happy about the party in their space. "I think we should go inside," he said quietly. But it was too late for quiet warnings. Thunder had reached the barn entrance and was surveying the scene inside. 60 people in formal wear were occupying his territory, eating at tables where he normally ate hay, dancing in the space where he normally slept. The bull's presence filled the doorway like a living wall. Conversation stopped as guests noticed the enormous animal standing at the entrance. The DJ's music continued playing, but the human sounds gradually faded to nervous whispers. "Is that thing supposed to be here?" someone asked. Karen turned from her position near the bar and saw Thunder blocking the main exit. Her face went from confident hostess to concerned homeowner in the span of 3 seconds. "Someone needs to call animal control," she announced, trying to maintain her authority over the situation. That was when Goliath appeared beside Thunder. Two bulls, each weighing over 2,000 pounds, now occupied the barn entrance. They were not aggressive, but they were definitely not moving. They were investigating their space, trying to understand why it was filled with strangers. The party guests began backing away from the entrance, clustering toward the far end of the barn. Elegant dresses and expensive suits were suddenly less important than maintaining distance from the massive animals. Thunder took his first step into the barn. His hooves made a deep, resonant sound on the wooden floor that had been covered with decorative rugs for the party. The sound system was still playing jazz music, creating a surreal soundtrack for the unfolding drama. "Everyone remain calm," Karen shouted over the music. "These animals are probably harmless." But her voice betrayed her growing panic. She was backing toward the rear wall of the barn, her designer heels clicking rapidly on the wooden planks. Goliath followed Thunder into the barn, and suddenly the spacious venue felt very small. The bulls were not aggressive, but they were curious. Thunder approached one of the catering tables, investigating the unfamiliar food smells. His massive head was easily large enough to clear the entire table with one sweep. The catering staff abandoned their stations and joined the guests in the far corner of the barn. Professional servers in black uniforms were pressed against the wall alongside suburban neighbors in cocktail attire. "This is unacceptable," Karen declared, pulling out her phone. "I am calling the police right now." But Thunder had discovered the appetizer table. His curiosity about the fancy food resulted in a gentle but devastating investigation. Expensive hors d'oeuvres scattered across the floor as the bull's massive head explored the foreign offerings. That was when the panic really began. Guests realized they were trapped in a barn with two enormous bulls who were now actively interacting with the party environment. The elegant evening was transforming into a wildlife encounter that none of them were prepared for. "We need to get out of here," someone shouted. But the bulls were blocking the main entrance, and the barn had limited exit options. Guests were clustering around the small side door, trying to evacuate in expensive clothes that were not designed for emergency farm situations. Goliath had discovered the sound equipment. His investigation of the speakers and wiring resulted in feedback squeals that added to the chaos. The jazz music cut out suddenly, replaced by the sounds of panicked party guests and curious bulls. I chose that moment to make my entrance. I walked calmly into the barn, carrying a lead rope and looking concerned about the safety of my animals. "Thunder, Goliath," I called out in a steady voice. "What are you boys doing in here?" Both bulls turned toward me, recognizing my voice and responding to my presence. They were not distressed or aggressive, just curious about the unusual activity in their territory. "Everyone please remain calm," I announced to the party guests. "These are my bulls. They are normally very gentle, but they are probably confused by all the activity in their barn." Karen pushed through the crowd to confront me, her elegant composure completely gone. "Get these animals out of here right now," she demanded. "You are ruining our event." I looked around at the chaos. Overturned tables, scattered food, broken decorations, and 60 terrified party guests pressed against the walls of my barn. "Your event?" I asked quietly. "In my barn, on my property." The next few minutes unfolded like a perfectly choreographed finale to months of harassment and violation. Karen stood in the center of my barn, surrounded by the ruins of her elegant party, demanding that I control animals on my own property. "I am calling the police," she declared, her phone